Locked outside, freezing, abandoned, Evelina's heartbeat races as the music swirls inside, the laughter mocking her pain, and then the glass shatters, his hand, the Duke's hand, reaching through the shards of the window. Was it pity, or is something darker drawing him to her? Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Invisible Daughter. The china teacup shattered against the wall beside Evelina's head, missing her by mere inches. She didn't flinch. 3 years had taught her that flinching only encouraged Lady Constance. Clumsy girl, her stepmother said, her voice sharp as the porcelain shards now scattered across the drawing-room floor. Clean it up, and when you've finished, the silver needs polishing before tomorrow's ball. Evelina bent to gather the pieces, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Fairmont House, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air, free in a way she would never be. This house, once filled with her father's laughter and her mother's gentle presence, had become a prison with walls made of duty and cruelty. "Yes, Lady Constance," she murmured, "and do not address me so formally. Call me Mother, Lady." Constance's lips curved in a smile that never reached her eyes. "We are family, after all." The word tasted like ash in Evelina's mouth, but she swallowed it down. "Yes, Mother. It hadn't always been this way. 3 years ago, Evelina had been Lady Evelina Fairmont, beloved daughter of Thomas Fairmont, a gentleman of modest but respectable means. Her father had been a man of quiet integrity, respected in the county for his honesty and warmth. When her mother had died, bringing her into the world, her father had loved her doubly, once for herself, and once for the wife he'd lost. Then, 5 years past her mother's death, he'd married Constance Ashworth, a widow with a daughter of her own. Evelina had tried to be happy for him. He'd seemed lonely, and she'd wanted nothing more than his happiness. But Constance had worn a mask in those early days, gracious, gentle, grateful for Thomas's kindness. The mask had slipped only after the wedding, and by then it was too late. When fever took her father in the winter of 1852, Evelina's world had shattered more completely than any teacup. Within a week, she'd gone from cherished daughter to unpaid servant. The modest inheritance her father had left became Constance's to control until Evelina reached her majority, and Constance had made it abundantly clear that Evelina would see none of it. "The silver, Evelina," Lady Constance reminded her, examining her nails with affected boredom. "It won't polish itself." Evelina carried the dustpan of broken china to the kitchen, then retrieved the silver service. As she worked, she could hear voices drifting from the upstairs drawing room, her stepmother and stepsister, discussing tomorrow's ball at Blackthorn Castle. "The Duke of Blackthorn will surely notice you this year, Isabel," Lady Constance cooed. "You've blossomed into such a beauty." Isabel's laugh was high and self-satisfied. "Do you truly think so, Mamma? Lord Ashford seemed quite taken with me at the Weatherby soiree." "Lord Ashford is acceptable, but Duke Armitage would be a triumph. Such a shame about his father. They say he's been quite altered since the late Duke's passing. Remote, cold, but eligible nonetheless." Evelina's hands stilled on the silver salver. The Duke of Blackthorn. She knew that name, though she couldn't quite place why it resonated so deeply. Something about her father. "And what of the ghost?" Isabel's voice dropped to a mock whisper that was clearly intended to carry. "Shall we bring our phantom sister to the ball?" Lady Constance's responding laugh was like cut glass. "The ghost of Fairmont House? I suppose we must. It would look peculiar otherwise. Though who would notice her? She's mastered the art of invisibility. Perhaps she'll haunt the refreshment table," Isabel giggled, "or hover by the drapes like the spectre she is." The words struck precisely where they were meant to land, but Evelina had long since learned to let such cruelty flow past her like water over stone. She was still here, still standing. That was victory enough. When the silver was polished to gleaming perfection and her other tasks completed, Evelina retreated to her small room in the attic, the room that had once been a servant's quarters and was now hers. It was cold and spare, but it was also private, and privacy had become precious. She lit a single candle and pulled her father's journal from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. The leather was worn soft with age, and she knew many of the entries by heart. Still, she opened it. seeking comfort in his familiar handwriting. The entry she found made her breath catch. June 18th, 48. Richard Armitage, Duke of Blackthorn, visited today. We walked the grounds as we did in our youth, and he spoke of his son, Samuel, a serious boy, he says, burdened too early with the weight of expectation. I told him of my Evelina, who shares that same thoughtful nature. Richard smiled and said, perhaps our children might find in each other what we have found in our friendship, a soul who understands the peculiar loneliness of duty. Let them find friendship, Thomas, he said. The world is cold enough without it. I found myself hoping he was right. How fine it would be if Evelina had such a friend, someone who understood what it means to carry a name, a legacy, an expectation, someone who might see her as I do, not as a duty, but as a gift. Evelina traced her fingers over her father's words. The Duke of Blackthorn, the late Duke, had been her father's dear friend. She'd forgotten, or perhaps she'd been too young to truly understand. And they'd spoken of friendship between their children. She thought of what she'd heard about the current Duke, remote, cold, altered by grief. Perhaps he, too, knew what it meant to lose everything. The thought was dangerous. It kindled something in her chest that felt perilously close to hope. Tomorrow night, she would attend the ball at Blackthorn Castle. She would be mocked and overlooked, dressed in whatever cast-off gown Lady Constance deemed appropriate for the ghost. She would stand at the edges of the ballroom, invisible as always, and yet, let them find friendship, her father had written. Evelina closed the journal and pressed it to her heart. Tomorrow she would face another humiliation. But tonight, alone in her cold attic room, she allowed herself to dream of something different. Not rescue, she'd learned better than to hope for that. But perhaps she might find one moment of genuine human connection. One person who might see her, truly see her, as her father once had. A knock at her door shattered the moment. Evelina, Lady Constance's voice was falsely sweet. Come down, dear. I found a gown for you to wear tomorrow. Evelina descended the narrow stairs to find her stepmother and stepsister waiting in the hall. Isabel held a dress, if it could be called that. The gown was at least 15 years out of fashion, the color a muddy sage that would make Evelina's complexion look sallow. The bodice was too tight, the skirts too wide, the sleeves absurdly puffed in a style that had been outdated when Evelina was a child. There, Lady Constance said, triumph bright in her eyes. Isn't it perfect? My own gown from my first season. I'm feeling quite generous, allowing you to wear it. Isabel smirked. She'll look positively memorable. Evelina took the gown, feeling the weight of tomorrow's inevitable humiliation. But beneath the resignation, that small flame of hope still flickered, stubborn and foolish. Thank you, she said quietly. Tomorrow will be such fun, Isabel said, her eyes glittering with malice. I can hardly wait. Alone again in her attic room, Evelina laid the hideous gown across her narrow bed. She should have known better than to hope. Nothing would be different tomorrow. Nothing ever was. But as she prepared for sleep, she found herself touching her father's journal once more. She thought of the Duke of Blackthorn, the late Duke's son, who had also lost a beloved parent, who also knew grief and duty and the weight of expectation, someone who might see her as I do, not as a duty, but as a gift. Perhaps tomorrow, Evelina whispered to her father's memory, to the darkness, to the impossible hope she couldn't quite extinguish, something will be different. The words hung in the air like a prayer. Outside her window, the autumn wind stirred the bare branches of the trees. Tomorrow night, there would be a ball. Tomorrow night, Evelina Fairmont would step into Blackthorn Castle, wearing a gown designed to humiliate her, expecting nothing, hoping for everything. Tomorrow night, everything would change. But tonight, she was simply a girl in a cold room, holding fast to her father's memory and the stubborn belief that somewhere in the world there might still be kindness waiting to be found. She blew out the candle and closed her eyes, willing sleep to come. In the darkness, the words whispered themselves again. Perhaps tomorrow, something will be different. Chapter 2. The ball at Blackthorn Castle. Samuel Armitage, Duke of Blackthorn, stood at the edge of his own ballroom and felt nothing. Around him, the cream of society swirled in a kaleidoscope of silk and jewels. The chandeliers blazed with 1,000 candles, their light catching on diamond necklaces and gold watch chains. The orchestra played a flawless waltz. Laughter rose and fell like waves against a distant shore. It was, by all accounts, a spectacular success. He felt hollow. "Your Grace." Lady Pemberton appeared at his elbow, her smile predatory. "Such a magnificent ball. You honor your dear father's memory with such elegance." Samuel inclined his head with practiced courtesy. "You are kind to say so. My daughter Charlotte is just there, the girl in blue. Such an accomplished pianist. Perhaps you might ask her to dance." Perhaps. The lie came easily. He had no intention of dancing with Charlotte Pemberton or any of the other young ladies who had been paraded before him like prize horses at auction. Lady Pemberton drifted away, satisfied for the moment, and Samuel resumed his surveillance of the room. This was his duty, now host, duke, eligible bachelor. The weight of it sat on his shoulders like his father's old military coat, too large and heavy for comfort. His father had loved these gatherings. Richard Armitage had possessed a gift for making people feel seen, valued, important. Samuel had inherited his title, his estate, his responsibilities, but not his warmth. "You must not let grief make you cold," his father had whispered in those final days. "Promise me, Samuel. Promise me you'll remain open to life, to love, to—" But his father had died before finishing the thought, and Samuel had been left with an incomplete promise and a heart that felt increasingly like stone. His eyes scanned the ballroom with the same disinterest they'd held for the past 2 seasons. Familiar faces, familiar games, familiar. He stopped. There, near the far wall, stood a young woman in a gown that looked like it belonged to another era entirely. The sage green was all wrong for her complexion, and the style, those absurd puffed sleeves, that outdated silhouette, made her stand out like a crow among peacocks. She stood perfectly still while the crowd eddied around her, a point of absolute stillness in a sea of motion. Something about that stillness caught him, held him. She wasn't admiring the ballroom or seeking conversation. She wasn't preening or flirting or laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. She was simply watching, as if she existed behind glass, observing a world she could see but not touch. Samuel knew that feeling. His mind reached back, grasping for a memory. He'd seen her before. Not just tonight before. The Wetherby Ball last spring. The Ashford Musicale in June. Always in ill-fitting gowns. Always alone. Always with that same quality of removed observation, as if she were studying a play in which she had no part. He'd noticed her then, how could he not? In a world of performance and pretense, her stillness had been arresting, but he'd done nothing about it. What was there to do? She was clearly gentry, clearly respectable enough to be invited to these gatherings, and clearly determined to remain unnoticed. Now, watching her across the ballroom, Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the ice. Evelina had known it would be bad. She had not anticipated it would be quite this excruciating. Blackthorn Castle was magnificent, all soaring ceilings and gleaming marble, with tapestries that probably cost more than her father's entire estate. The ballroom alone could have swallowed Fairmont House whole. Crystal chandeliers cast light like captured stars, and the orchestra played with such skill that even the waltzes seemed to shimmer. She had never felt more invisible, or more visible, in all the wrong ways. The gown Lady Constance had given her was a calculated cruelty. Evelina had known it the moment she'd put it on, but there had been no alternative. Arriving in her day dress would have been worse. So she'd endured Isabel's poorly concealed laughter during the carriage ride, and now endured the sidelong glances of strangers who clearly wondered how someone so poorly dressed had managed an invitation. "Don't wander off," Lady Constance had hissed upon their arrival. "Stay close and try not to embarrass us further." But within minutes, her stepmother and stepsister had drifted away, drawn toward more promising social opportunities. Evelina was left alone near the wall, a piece of furniture no one quite knew what to do with. She told herself it was better this way. Better to be overlooked than mocked. Better to observe than participate in a world that had made it abundantly clear she didn't belong. Still, watching Isabel flutter from gentleman to gentleman, her pink gown catching the light beautifully, her laughter bright and practiced, Evelina felt the old familiar ache. Not envy, exactly. More like grief for the life that might have been hers if her father had lived. "You're worth 10 of them," her father had told her once, when she'd cried over some childhood slight. "Anyone who cannot see that is blind, and we needn't concern ourselves with the blind." But the blind were everywhere, it seemed. A burst of laughter drew her attention. Isabel had captured the attention of 3 young men, including Lord Ashford, who seemed quite enchanted. As Evelina watched, her stepsister's eyes flickered toward her, gleaming with malicious triumph. Evelina looked away and found herself staring directly into the eyes of the Duke of Blackthorn. The connection lasted only a moment. He was standing halfway across the ballroom, partially obscured by dancing couples, but the intensity of his gaze struck her like a physical thing. Dark eyes beneath darker brows, a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so severe, an expression of such focused attention that for a heartbeat, Evelina forgot to breathe. Then reality reasserted itself. He wasn't looking at her. He couldn't be. He was looking past her, or through her, at something else entirely. She turned away quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment at her own presumption. Behind her, she didn't see the Duke's eyes narrow slightly, tracking her movement. Didn't see him take a step forward before being intercepted by another guest, seeking his attention. Samuel half listened to Lord Pemberton's enthusiastic description of his new hunter, while his eyes searched the ballroom. Where had she gone? The woman in the outdated green gown, she'd been right there. And then, there, still near the wall, but she'd shifted position, angling herself slightly away as if trying to become part of the wallpaper. Who was she? The question lodged in his mind with unexpected urgency. He should know. If she attended these balls regularly enough for him to have noticed her repeatedly, he should know her name, her family, her, Your Grace? Samuel realized Lord Pemberton had asked him a question. Forgive me, you were saying. As Lord Pemberton repeated himself, Samuel found his attention dividing. Part of him maintained the conversation with appropriate nods and murmurs. The other part remained locked on the young woman, who seemed determined to disappear into the architecture. There was something familiar about her beyond the previous balls, something that tugged at memory just beyond reach. Had his father mentioned? The thought dissolved as he watched an older woman in emerald silk approach the girl. Even from this distance, Samuel could see the girl's posture stiffen, her chin lifting in a gesture that was either defiance or defense. The woman in emerald spoke. The girl in green listened, her face carefully blank. Then another young woman joined them, the one in pink who'd been collecting admirers like flowers. She leaned close to the girl in green and whispered something. The girl in green's hands clenched at her sides. Samuel felt his jaw tighten. He recognized cruelty when he saw it, even at a distance. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," Lady Constance murmured, her smile never wavering for the benefit of watching eyes. "Standing about like a lost sheep. At least try to appear as if you belong here." Evelina kept her voice low and even. "Where would you have me stand, Mother?" "Anywhere but where you draw attention to that ridiculous gown." Lady Constance's eyes glittered, though I suppose there's no help for it now. Isabel appeared at her mother's elbow, breathless from dancing. "Lord Ashford has asked me to take the air on the terrace," she announced. Then, turning to Evelina with exaggerated concern, "Sister, do come outside for a moment. I must speak with you privately." Every instinct Evelina possessed screamed warning. Isabel's tone was too sweet, her smile too sharp, Lady Constance's expression too satisfied. "I'm quite comfortable here," Evelina said carefully. "Don't be difficult." Lady Constance's voice hardened. "Your sister wishes to speak with you. Surely you can grant her a moment of your precious time." There was no refusing without causing a scene. And scenes, Evelina had learned, always resulted in worse consequences later. "Of course," she said quietly. Isabel linked her arm through Evelina's with false sisterly affection, guiding her through the crowd toward the tall glass doors that led to the balcony. "It won't take but a moment," she cooed, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Just a small matter of family business." They passed close to where the Duke stood, speaking with an elderly gentleman. Evelina kept her eyes forward, but she felt his gaze like heat against her skin. Or perhaps that was imagination. Perhaps she was so starved for kindness that she invented it where none existed. The balcony doors loomed ahead, their glass panels reflecting the ballroom's light like dark mirrors. Isabel's grip on her arm tightened. "Sister, do come outside for a moment," Isabel repeated, her voice pitched for Evelina's ears alone now, stripped of its false sweetness. "I must speak with you privately." And Evelina, trapped by duty and fear and the learned helplessness of 3 years' cruelty, let herself be led toward whatever fresh humiliation awaited her in the cold November night. Behind them, unnoticed, the Duke of Blackthorn's eyes followed their progress toward the balcony doors, a frown beginning to crease his brow. Chapter 3. Locked in the cold. The November air struck Evelina like a slap the moment she stepped onto the balcony. The stone terrace overlooked the castle gardens, now bare and skeletal in the moonlight. From inside, The ballroom had seemed almost unbearably warm with the press of bodies and the heat of 1,000 candles. Out here, the cold was immediate and punishing. "Well then," Isabel said, releasing Evelina's arm with a little push that sent her stumbling forward. "Let's have our little chat, shall we?" Evelina turned to face her stepsister, wrapping her inadequate shawl thin muslin, more decorative than functional, tighter around her shoulders. "What did you wish to discuss?" For a moment, Isabel simply stared at her, and in her eyes, Evelina saw something that made her stomach clench. Not just malice, something deeper, something almost like pain twisted into hatred. "Do you know what it's like," Isabel said softly, "to have a ghost haunting your life?" "I don't understand." "Of course you don't." Isabel's laugh was brittle. "You stand there in your hideous gown, with your martyr's dignity, and you don't understand anything. My mother speaks of you constantly. Evelina's father was such a gentleman. Evelina's manners are so refined. Evelina would never be so forward." Her voice rose with each sentence. "Do you know what it's like to live in the shadow of someone who's already dead?" "My father." "Not your father, you fool. You." Isabel took a step closer, her beautiful face ugly with resentment. "You with your sad eyes and your quiet suffering. You make everyone around you feel small. Even in that ridiculous dress, even standing alone and pathetic, somehow you make the rest of us look cheap." Evelina felt something cold settle in her chest, and it had nothing to do with the November wind. "I've never tried to make you feel anything. I've only tried to stay out of your way, and that's exactly the problem." Isabel's voice cracked. "You don't fight back, you don't argue, you just endure. And somehow that makes you noble while the rest of us are petty and cruel." She moved backward toward the glass doors. "Well, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of the ghost of Fairmont House haunting my life." Understanding came too late. Evelina lunged forward, but Isabel was already through the doorway. "Isabel, wait." The door closed with a soft click. Through the glass, Evelina watched her stepsister's hand move to the latch, sliding the bolt home with deliberate slowness. Their eyes met through the glass panel, and Isabel's smile was terrible in its satisfaction. "You don't belong here," Isabel said, her voice muffled but audible through the glass. "You've never belonged anywhere." Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd, her pink gown swallowed by the swirl of dancers. For a moment, Evelina stood frozen, her mind struggling to accept what had just happened. Then panic seized her. She grabbed the door handle and pulled, knowing it was futile but unable to stop herself. The door didn't budge. She knocked gently at first, then harder. "Please," she called, though she knew no one would hear. "Please, someone." The orchestra swelled into a new piece, drowning out her words. Through the glass, she could see the ballroom in all its glittering splendor. Ladies in jewel-toned gowns danced with gentlemen in black evening clothes. Servers wove through the crowd with trays of champagne. Laughter and conversation rose in waves she could no longer hear properly, the sounds reaching her muffled and distorted through the thick glass. She might as well have been watching a play from outside the theater. Evelina pounded harder on the glass, her fist striking the pane with increasing desperation. Surely someone would notice. Surely someone would see her and realize. But no one looked her way. The ball continued without her, as if she'd never been there at all, as if she'd never existed. The cold seeped through her thin gown and thinner shawl, settling into her bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, still knocking, still hoping, still waiting for someone to notice that she was missing. The familiar ache of abandonment spread through her chest, the same feeling she'd had when her father died, when the servants who'd known her since childhood had been dismissed, when Lady Constance had moved her belongings to the attic. That hollowing sense of being erased, of becoming invisible while still breathing. "Worth 10 of them," her father's voice whispered in her memory. "Anyone who cannot see that is blind." But they were all blind. Every single person in that ballroom, dancing and laughing and drinking champagne, was blind to her existence. She was the ghost of Fairmont House, indeed visible but unseen, present but absent, alive but already mourned. Her fist struck the glass one more time, weaker now. Her hand ached. Her throat hurt from calling out. The cold was making her shake, though she couldn't tell if it was the temperature or something breaking inside her. She could die out here, she realized. The temperature was dropping as the night deepened. She could freeze to death on this balcony while the Tun danced 3 feet away, and no one would notice until they found her body in the morning. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a strange, distant anger. No, The word formed in her mind with sudden, crystalline clarity. No, she would not do this, would not stand here pounding on glass like a beggar pleading for scraps, would not make herself smaller and quieter and more desperate in hopes that someone might finally deem her worthy of basic human kindness. Evelina stepped back from the door. Her hands were shaking with cold, with rage, with something that felt dangerously close to liberation. She pulled her shawl tighter, lifted her chin, and turned to face the glass doors with her spine straight and her shoulders back. If they wanted her to be a ghost, she would be a ghost, but she would be one that haunted with dignity. "I will not disappear," she whispered to the night, to her father's memory, to whatever part of herself she'd been slowly losing over the past 3 years. Not tonight. She would stand here in the cold, she would endure, but she would not beg. The ballroom swirled before her eyes, all that light and warmth and life that she'd never truly been part of. And as she watched, the crowd seemed to part slightly, and across the vast expanse of polished floor, she saw him. The Duke of Blackthorn stood motionless among the moving dancers, a point of stillness in a sea of motion. And he was looking directly at her. Their eyes met across the impossible distance, through the glass that separated them like the surface of a frozen lake. Evelina's breath caught. She should look away. Convention, propriety, simple self-preservation demanded it. But something in his gaze held her captive. He wasn't looking past her. He wasn't looking through her. He was seeing her. For the first time in 3 years, perhaps for the first time since her father had died, someone was truly, completely seeing her. Not the ghost, not the shadow, not the unfortunate stepdaughter in the hideous gown. Her. The cold receded, or perhaps she simply stopped feeling it. The world narrowed to that single connection, his dark eyes locked with hers, neither of them looking away, neither of them pretending the other didn't exist. Evelina didn't know what her face showed. She couldn't control her expression, couldn't summon the blank mask she'd learned to wear. All she could do was stand there, shaking with cold and defiance, and something that felt terrifyingly like hope, and meet his gaze with her own. She watched his expression change. Something shifted behind his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or realization. His jaw tightened, his shoulders straightened. He set down the glass he'd been holding, and then slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving hers, the Duke of Blackthorn began to move. He didn't walk. He cut through the crowd like a ship through water, his path direct and unwavering. Dancers stumbled aside. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned to follow his progress. Confusion and curiosity rippling through the ballroom in his wake. But he didn't slow, didn't pause, didn't acknowledge anyone who tried to catch his attention. His eyes remained locked on hers. And in them, Evelina saw something that made her heart pound against her ribs. Not pity, not curiosity, but a fierce, focused intensity that promised action. The cold disappeared entirely. The humiliation of the locked door faded. Even the fear that had been her constant companion for 3 years receded in the face of what she saw approaching. Someone had seen her. Someone was coming. And in that moment, standing alone on a freezing balcony while the Duke of Blackthorn strode toward her with the force of divine retribution in his eyes, Evelina understood that her father had been right. She was worth more than they'd made her believe. She deserved more than they'd made her accept. And perhaps impossibly, miraculously, she was about to receive it. The Duke was 10 feet away now, then 5. His face was stern, almost frightening in its intensity. His hands were already reaching not for the door handle, but for something else. Through the glass, their eyes met one final time, and Evelina, who had learned to expect nothing and hope for less, felt something inside her chest break open like spring after endless winter. Whatever happened next, she would not face it as a ghost. She would face it as herself. Chapter 4. Shattered Glass. Samuel had witnessed cruelty before, in business dealings, in political maneuvering, in the casual dismissals that privilege afforded. But watching that young woman locked outside in the November cold, while the ball continued without pause, ignited something in him he'd thought long extinguished. It wasn't pity. Pity was distant, safe, condescending. This was recognition. He saw in her stillness what he felt every day of his life since his father's death, the exhaustion of maintaining dignity while the world moved on, indifferent to your pain, the loneliness of being surrounded by people yet entirely alone, the quiet desperation of hoping someone, anyone, might truly see you. And more than that, he saw her refusal to beg. She'd stopped pounding on the glass. stopped pleading. Instead, she stood straight-backed and defiant in a gown designed to humiliate her, facing the ballroom with her chin high and her eyes blazing. Even shaking with cold, even abandoned and alone, she stood like a queen surveying her kingdom rather than a beggar pleading for entrance. Something in Samuel's chest cracked open a fissure in the ice that had encased his heart for 2 years. He didn't think. Thinking would have meant hesitation, propriety, concern for scandal. He simply moved. The crowd parted before him without conscious awareness. Faces blurred at the periphery of his vision, surprised, curious, concerned. He registered none of them. His entire focus narrowed to the young woman on the other side of the glass, watching him approach with an expression that was equal parts fear and desperate hope. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton materialized at his elbow, her fan fluttering. "Is something amiss? You look quite—" He walked past her without acknowledgement. "Blackthorn," Lord Ashford's voice carried across the ballroom. "Surely whatever the matter is." Samuel didn't slow. He was aware, distantly, that conversations were halting, that dancers were stumbling to stops, that all eyes were turning to follow his progress across the ballroom floor. The orchestra faltered and died, leaving only the rustle of silk and the sharp click of his boots against marble. He reached the glass doors. Through them, he could see her more clearly now, the pallor of her skin, the blue tinge to her lips, the violent shaking she was trying to control. Her eyes, enormous in her face, fixed on his with an intensity that felt like a physical pull. "Your Grace." A footman appeared, bowing hastily. "The door seems to be latched from inside. If you'll allow me a moment to fetch the key." "Step back," Samuel said quietly. The footman blinked. "Your Grace?" "Step back, now." Something in his tone brooked no argument. The footman retreated, confusion evident on his face. Samuel turned to survey the ballroom. Every eye was upon him. Perfect. Let them watch. Let them all witness what happened to those who showed cruelty in his house. He picked up one of the delicate gilt chairs that lined the wall's furniture, chosen for elegance rather than function, worth more than most people earned in a year. Without hesitation, he raised it above his head. "Your Grace," someone gasped. He couldn't tell who. "Surely a servant can unlock the door." Samuel didn't even acknowledge the suggestion. His eyes found the young woman's through the glass. She stared back at him, her expression transformed from defiance to shock. He could have simply unlocked the door, could have summoned servants, maintained decorum, addressed the situation with appropriate discretion, but then she would have stood there waiting, hoping, wondering if someone would deem her worthy of being let back in, and he found that he would not make her wait 1 second longer. Samuel brought the chair down with all his strength. The sound of shattering glass was tremendous in the sudden silence. A collective gasp rose from the assembled guests as the door exploded inward in a cascade of glittering shards. They rained down like diamonds in the candlelight, scattering across the marble floor in 1,000 brilliant fragments. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Samuel dropped what remained of the chair and reached through the jagged opening. His hand found hers, small, freezing, trembling. Her skin was like ice against his palm. "Come," he said. She stared at him, frozen in shock or disbelief or both. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Samuel stepped closer, glass crunching under his boots. Still holding her hand, he reached through with his other arm and grasped her waist. Gently but firmly, he pulled her through the shattered doorway and into the warmth of the ballroom. She stumbled slightly as she crossed the threshold, whether from cold or shock. He couldn't tell. His arm tightened around her waist, steadying her, and suddenly they were standing mere inches apart. Her hand still clasped in his other arm around her waist, her face tilted up to his. Their eyes met. Up close, he could see that her eyes were grey, not the pale grey of rain, but the deep grey of winter twilight. They were enormous in her pale face, framed by dark lashes, and filled with an expression he couldn't quite name. Shock, certainly, but beneath it, something else, something that made his breath catch in his throat. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Do you understand me?" "Nothing." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I didn't," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold. "I wasn't." "Nothing," he repeated firmly. Then, realizing he was still holding her waist, he released her with deliberate care and shrugged out of his evening jacket. Without asking permission, she was shaking so violently, her teeth were chattering, he draped it around her shoulders. The jacket swallowed her small frame. His hands lingered on her shoulders a moment longer than strictly necessary, adjusting the fabric, ensuring it covered her properly. He could feel the shaking gradually subsiding as his body heat transferred through the wool. Her eyes never left his face, and he found he couldn't look away from hers. "Your Grace." The spell shattered. Samuel turned to find the entire ballroom staring at them in various states of shock, scandal, and fascination. The silence was absolute. Even the servants had stopped moving, frozen like figures in a painting. Then the whispers began. "Did you see?" Smashed the glass with his bare hands. "Who is she?" "Never seen him so." "Heavens," an elderly gentleman murmured nearby Lord Waverley, his father's oldest friend. "He looks just like his father did when—" The old man caught himself, but his eyes were knowing, almost approving. Samuel ignored them all. He turned back to the young woman, who was now clutching his jacket around herself like armor, her eyes wide with dawning horror as she realized they had an audience. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her legs were visibly unsteady. Samuel offered his arm. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve. He could feel the trembling that still ran through her. He began to guide her away from the shattered glass, away from the staring crowd, toward the private wing of the castle, where he could ensure she received proper care, a physician, warm clothes, hot tea, safety. "Your Grace." The voice cut through the whispers like a blade. Samuel turned to see a woman in emerald silk pushing through the crowd, her face a mask of horrified indignation. Behind her, a younger woman in pink, the one he'd seen, speaking with his guest on the balcony moments before the door closed, had gone pale as death. "Your Grace, I must insist." The woman in emerald reached them, slightly breathless. "This is highly irregular. That girl is my responsibility. My stepdaughter. I really must." Samuel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw in her eyes the same cold calculation he'd learned to recognize in those who valued appearance over substance, status over kindness. This was the woman who had raised the girl trembling beside him. This was the woman in whose house she lived. This was the woman under whose care she had learned to expect nothing. "Your responsibility," Samuel repeated, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. Each word was precise, controlled, edged with ice. "Your stepdaughter was locked outside on a freezing balcony during a ball at my castle, in my house, under my hospitality." The woman paled slightly. "A misunderstanding, surely. The door must have—" "The door was latched from inside," Samuel interrupted. "There was no misunderstanding. Nevertheless, she is my charge, and I really must insist that you allow me to—" "Not anymore." The two words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Samuel felt the girl beside him stiffen in surprise. The woman in emerald blinked, confusion crossing her features. "I beg your pardon." "Not anymore," Samuel repeated, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Miss—" He paused, realizing he didn't know her name, didn't know anything about her, except that she'd stood on his balcony with dignity and tact while the world tried to break her. He looked down at her. "Your name?" "Evelina," she whispered. "Evelina Fairmont." The name struck him like lightning. Fairmont, Thomas Fairmont, his father's dearest friend, the daughter his father had made him promise to watch over if anything happened to. Everything fell into place with sickening clarity. The promise his father had extracted on his deathbed, the girl he was supposed to protect from a distance. The reason her stillness at previous balls had haunted him some unconscious recognition, perhaps, of a duty unfulfilled. He'd failed his father's last request. For 3 years, he'd noticed her at balls and done nothing, watched her stand alone and did nothing, observed her quiet suffering and did nothing. Not anymore. Samuel turned back to the woman in emerald, his expression hardening. "Lady Fairmont, I presume? Or do you prefer your previous name?" "Lady Constance Fairmont," the woman said stiffly. "Lady Constance." Samuel's voice could have frozen fire. "Miss Evelina Fairmont is a guest of Blackthorn Castle, and will remain so for as long as she wishes. Is that understood?" Lady Constance's face flushed. "You cannot simply—" "I can," Samuel said softly, "and I have. This conversation is concluded." He turned away, dismissing her as thoroughly as one might dismiss a servant. Beside him, Evelina swayed slightly. He tightened his arm, supporting her weight as he guided her through the parting crowd. Behind them, the whispers erupted into a roar of speculation, but Samuel didn't care. His father had asked him to protect Thomas Fairmont's daughter. He'd failed that duty for 3 years. He would not fail it again. Chapter 5. The Awakening. The private sitting room was smaller than the ballroom, but no less elegant. A fire crackled in the marble hearth, filling the space with warmth that felt almost violent after the cold of the balcony. Evelina stood near the flames, still wrapped in the Duke's jacket, trying to stop shaking. She wasn't sure if the trembling was from cold anymore. "Mrs. Fletcher," Samuel was saying to the housekeeper, who'd appeared with remarkable speed, "send for Dr. Harrison immediately, and have the Rose Room prepared fresh linens, a hot bath, warm clothes, whatever Miss Fairmont requires. At once, Your Grace." The older woman's eyes were kind as they swept over Evelina. "Poor lamb. I'll see to it personally. And tea, hot, with plenty of sugar." "Yes, Your Grace." The housekeeper departed, leaving them alone. Samuel moved to the sideboard and poured something amber into a glass. He brought it to Evelina, pressing it into her hands. "Brandy," he said, "for the cold." Evelina's hands wrapped around the glass automatically, seeking its warmth. She took a small sip and nearly choked as the liquid burned down her throat, but the warmth spread through her chest, loosening something tight that had formed there. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't." His voice was sharp. Then, softer. "Please don't thank me for basic human decency." She looked up at him properly for the first time since they'd entered the room. In the golden firelight, his face was all sharp angles and shadows. His jaw was tight, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. His hands opened and closed at his sides in a rhythm that suggested barely controlled emotion. When he spoke, his voice maintained careful control, but she could hear the fury beneath it, not directed at her, but on her behalf. The realization made something flutter in her chest. "I should apologize," she began, "for causing a scene, for disrupting your ball, for—" "If you apologize to me," Samuel interrupted, his eyes locking on hers with sudden intensity, "I will think less of you. Do you understand? You have done nothing wrong. Nothing." The words hit her with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had told her she wasn't at fault? When had anyone looked at her suffering and placed blame where it belonged on those who inflicted it, not on her for enduring it? "Your ball is ruined," she said quietly. "Good." The word was savage. "Let it be ruined. Let every person in that ballroom remember what they witnessed tonight. Perhaps it will make them think twice before turning blind eyes to cruelty in the future." He moved to the fire, gripping the mantelpiece with both hands, his back to her. The tension in his shoulders was visible even through his waistcoat. Evelina took another sip of brandy, feeling it burn away some of the numbness. "My stepmother," she said carefully. "She will be very angry." "Your stepmother," Samuel said without turning, "has no power here. She has power everywhere that I am." Now he did turn, and the look on his face made her breath catch. "Then perhaps you shouldn't go back to where she is." The suggestion hung in the air between them, impossible and tempting in equal measure. "I have nowhere else," Evelina said. It wasn't self-pity, merely fact. "You have here, for tonight certainly, for longer, if you wish it. I cannot simply—" She stopped, overwhelmed by the strangeness of the evening, by this man's inexplicable kindness, by the way her entire world seemed to have tilted on its axis in the span of minutes. "Why did you do it?" Samuel's brow furrowed. "Do what?" "Break the glass." She set down the brandy glass, her hands steadier now. "You could have simply unlocked the door. It would have been simpler, quieter, more proper. Why did you shatter it?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the castle, a clock chimed the hour. Samuel's dark eyes studied her face as if searching for something. "I could have unlocked it," he finally said. "You're right. It would have been the sensible thing to do." He took a step closer, "But then you would have been standing there waiting, hoping someone would let you in, wondering if you were worth the effort of turning a key." Another step. They were close enough now that she could see the flecks of amber in his brown eyes. "I wanted you to know," he continued, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. "No more waiting, no more locked doors, no more standing in the cold while the world decides whether you deserve warmth." The words settled into Evelina's chest like seeds in fertile ground. She felt something shift inside her, some fundamental understanding of herself, of what she deserved, of what she'd been allowing. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "No," he agreed, "but I know what I saw tonight. I know dignity when I see it, and I know cruelty." His jaw tightened again. "I know what it looks like when someone has learned to expect nothing and still maintains grace." The moment stretched between them, electric and unspoken. Evelina felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with cold or wet clothes. He was seeing her, really seeing her, and she didn't know whether to hide or step closer to that seeing. A knock at the door broke the spell. Mrs. Fletcher entered with a tea tray, followed by a stern-looking man carrying a medical bag. "Dr. Harrison, Your Grace," the housekeeper announced. Samuel stepped back, creating proper distance. "Doctor, thank you for coming so quickly." "Of course, Your Grace." The physician's eyes moved to Evelina with professional assessment. "Now then, young lady, let's have a look at you." "I'll leave you to it," Samuel said, moving toward the door. Then he paused, turning back. "Miss Fairmont, you'll stay tonight. That's not a request." It should have sounded imperious. Instead, it sounded like a promise. After he left, Dr. Harrison examined her with efficient kindness, declaring her cold but otherwise unharmed, recommending hot tea, warm clothes, and rest. Mrs. Fletcher fussed over her like a mother hen, providing all three with admirable speed. But even as Evelina was examined and warmed and cared for, her mind remained on the Duke's words. No more waiting, no more locked doors. An hour later, Evelina found herself alone in what Mrs. Fletcher called the Rose Room. It was beautiful, all cream silk and pale pink roses, with a fire blazing in the hearth and a bed that looked softer than clouds. Someone had laid out a nightgown and dressing robe, both of fine quality. Evelina moved to the window, looking out over the darkened gardens. The ball would still be continuing, or perhaps it had ended early, scandal having a way of cutting evenings short. Either way, she was here, in the Duke of Blackthorn's castle, wearing his jacket over the borrowed nightgown because she couldn't quite bring herself to remove it. She lifted the collar to her nose, sandalwood, leather, and something else she couldn't name, something distinctly him. A knock startled her. She opened the door to find Samuel standing in the hallway, looking oddly uncertain for a man who'd shattered glass doors with chairs hours earlier. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "I wanted to ensure you had everything you needed." "More than I could have imagined," Evelina replied honestly. "Thank you." He waved away her thanks. Then, as if the words were pulled from him against his will, "Your father, he was Thomas Fairmont, wasn't he?" Surprise rippled through her. "Yes. You knew him?" "I didn't, but my father did." Samuel's expression softened in a way she hadn't yet seen, grief and fondness mingling. He spoke of him often, called him the most honest man he'd ever known, said Thomas Fairmont had integrity that couldn't be bought or bent. Tears pricked Evelina's eyes. "That sounds like Papa. My father died 2 years ago." "I understand yours passed 3 years past." "Yes." The word came out rough. "I'm sorry." And he sounded it genuinely, deeply sorry in a way that suggested he understood the weight of that loss. "My father, he made me promise something before he died, about watching over Thomas Fairmont's daughter if anything happened to ensure she was—" He stopped abruptly, as if catching himself. "I failed that promise. I should have." "You couldn't have known," Evelina said quietly. "I saw you, at other balls. I noticed you were alone, and I did nothing." "You noticed me?" The words came out more vulnerable than she'd intended. His eyes met hers. "Every time." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. "I should let you rest," Samuel said, though he made no move to leave. "Tomorrow, we'll discuss what happens next, your options, what you want." He emphasized the last word deliberately. "What I want," Evelina repeated, as if testing how the words felt in her mouth. "What you want," he confirmed. "No more decisions made for you, no more locked doors." After he left, Evelina returned to the window, the Duke's jacket still wrapped around her shoulders. She touched the fine wool, remembering the way he'd draped it over her, the way his hands had lingered. She should remove it, should hang it up, return it in the morning with proper thanks. But she didn't want to take it off. Not yet. For the first time in 3 years, Evelina Fairmont fell asleep feeling safe, and warm, and, impossibly, seen. Chapter 6. The Space Between. Evelina woke to sunlight, not the thin, grudging light that filtered through the attic window at Fairmont House, but genuine sunlight, golden and warm, streaming through tall windows framed by silk curtains the color of cream. For a moment, she simply lay there, disoriented by comfort. The mattress beneath her was soft, the linens smelled of lavender, and the room was blissfully, impossibly warm. Then memory returned. The ball, the balcony, the shattered glass, the Duke's dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that had shaken something loose inside her chest. She sat up slowly, half expecting the room to vanish like a dream. But no, it remained solid and real. The Rose Room, Mrs. Fletcher had called it. A guest room in Blackthorn Castle. A sanctuary. A knock at the door made her start. "Miss Fairmont?" A young maid entered, carrying a breakfast tray that made Evelina's eyes widen. "Good morning, miss. His Grace thought you might be hungry." The tray held more food than Evelina typically saw in a week. Eggs, toast with butter and jam, bacon, fresh fruit, tea in a delicate china pot. Her stomach growled audibly. "His Grace also requests," the maid continued, setting the tray on a small table near the window, "if you might be amenable to joining him for a walk in the gardens after breakfast. If you're feeling well enough, that is. There's no pressure if you'd prefer to rest." Evelina found herself nodding before she'd fully considered it. "Yes. Tell him yes. I would like that." The maid smiled. "Very good, miss. I'll return in an hour to help you dress. His Grace had some clothes sent from the village this morning. He estimated your size. I hope they'll do." After the maid left, Evelina ate slowly, savoring every bite. When had she last eaten without anxiety, without Lady Constance's cold eyes cataloguing every mouthful as evidence of greed? When had food last tasted like pleasure rather than survival? The clothes, when the maid returned with them, were simple but well made. A day dress in soft blue wool, undergarments that actually fit, a warm pelisse, and sturdy walking boots. Everything was new, unchipped by previous wearers, chosen for comfort rather than humiliation. Evelina caught sight of herself in the mirror as the maid finished arranging her hair. She looked different, not transformed. She was still herself, still too thin, still too pale. But there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there yesterday, something that looked dangerously like hope. Samuel was waiting in the entrance hall, looking out toward the gardens. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and something in his expression shifted, softened, when he saw her. "Miss Fairmont, you slept well, I hope." "Better than I have in years," Evelina admitted. "Thank you for the clothes. You shouldn't have." "I should have," he interrupted gently. "And I wanted to. Shall we?" He offered his arm. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. The gardens of Blackthorn Castle were vast, even in their November bareness. The summer flowers were long gone, but there was beauty in the architecture of it, the careful paths, the skeletal trees, the evergreen hedges providing structure and shelter. Their breath misted in the cold air as they walked. "I should explain," Samuel began, then stopped, started again. "Last night, I mentioned my father's friendship with yours. Yes, there's more to it than simple friendship. But first," he paused on the path, turning to face her, "I want you to know that what I'm about to tell you doesn't change what happened last night, or what I hope might happen going forward." Evelina's heart beat faster. "What do you hope might happen?" A slight smile touched his lips. "That we might become acquainted, properly, without locked doors or shattered glass between us." "I would like that," she said softly. They resumed walking. For a while, neither spoke, but it was a comfortable silence. Evelina found herself noticing details, the way Samuel's jaw relaxed slightly in the open air, as if he too felt freed by the absence of watching eyes, the care with which he adjusted his pace to hers, the way he seemed to be choosing his words carefully, as if they mattered. "Do you read?" he asked suddenly. The question surprised her. "Yes, when I can. Lady Constance believes novels are frivolous, but I—" She stopped, unwilling to confess how she'd hoarded her father's books, reading by candlelight in her attic room. "But you read them anyway," Samuel finished, and there was approval in his voice. "What do you prefer? Gothic romances? Moral tales? Poetry, actually." The admission felt strangely vulnerable. There's something about the way a good poem can capture an entire world in a few lines, make you feel less alone. Samuel stopped walking. "You prefer poetry? I know it's not fashionable." "No, it's just I prefer poetry as well." He sounded almost wondering. "Most people I meet have no patience for it. They want novels with plots and resolutions. But poetry is honest," Evelina said. "It doesn't pretend life has neat endings." "Exactly." He looked at her with new interest. "Do you have a favorite poet?" "Wordsworth. I know he's considered old-fashioned now, but there's one line that always—" She stopped, suddenly, self-conscious. "Which line?" She took a breath. "The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers." Samuel's expression transformed. "Little we see in nature that is ours," he continued, his voice quiet but certain. "We have given our hearts away. A sordid boon." They finished together. "This sea that bears her bosom to the moon." Evelina felt something warm bloom in her chest. When was the last time she'd shared words with someone who understood their weight? When had anyone looked at her with this expression, surprise and recognition, and something that felt like delight? She smiled. Actually smiled, not the careful, controlled expression she'd learned to wear at Fairmont House, but a genuine smile that came from somewhere deep and long dormant. Samuel's face softened as he saw it. "You should do that more often." "Do what?" "Smile. It transforms your entire face." She felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked away, flustered by the compliment. They resumed walking, but something had shifted between them, some invisible barrier had thinned. "Tell me about your father," Samuel said. "What was he like?" The question should have hurt. Instead, it felt like permission. And so Evelina found herself speaking carefully at first, then with growing ease about Thomas Fairmont, about his gentle wisdom and his terrible jokes, about the way he'd taught her to see kindness as strength rather than weakness, about Sunday walks and evening conversations, and the way he'd made her feel that her thoughts and opinions mattered. Samuel listened without interruption. No judgment, no pity, no awkward platitudes. Just complete, focused attention, the rarest gift of all. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "He sounds like he was a remarkable man." "He was." She glanced at Samuel. "What was your father like?" Something shuttered in Samuel's expression, then deliberately opened again, as if he'd decided to trust her with the truth. "He was a good man who made mistakes. He loved deeply, too deeply perhaps. My mother died when I was young, and I think he never recovered from that loss." He paused. "He wanted me to have what he lost, genuine partnership in marriage, built on mutual respect and affection, but he went about it the wrong way." "What do you mean?" Samuel hesitated, and Evelina could see him weighing his words. "There's something I need to tell you about our fathers, about promises that were made." A commotion at the castle entrance interrupted him. They both turned to see a carriage rolling up the drive, elegant, expensive, drawn by matched greys. Samuel went very still beside her. "No." "What is it?" Evelina asked. The carriage door opened. A woman stepped out, beautiful in the way that magazine illustrations were beautiful, all perfect proportions and practiced grace. Her traveling dress was the height of fashion, her blonde hair arranged in elaborate curls beneath a stylish bonnet. She looked around the courtyard with the air of someone surveying familiar territory. Then her eyes found them in the garden. "Samuel, darling," her voice carried across the distance, bright and possessive. "We need to talk." Evelina felt Samuel tense beside her. She looked up at his face and saw something that made her stomach drop. Not love, she was certain of that, but dread, yes, and underneath it, unmistakable guilt. "Clara," Samuel said, his voice flat. "What are you doing here?" The woman Clara began walking toward them, her smile sharp as the broken glass that had littered the ballroom floor the night before. "Is that any way to greet an old friend?" Her eyes swept over Evelina with cool assessment. "And who is this?" Evelina felt suddenly small in her borrowed dress, provincial and plain next to this woman's polished elegance. She started to step back, to create distance between herself and Samuel, but his hand caught her arm gently. "This is Miss Evelina Fairmont," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "She's a guest at Blackthorn. Miss Fairmont, may I present Miss Clara Ashford?" "How charming," Clara said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Samuel, I really must speak with you, privately. It's rather urgent. Whatever you need to say can wait until—" "It cannot wait." Clara's voice hardened. "It concerns matters from 2 years ago that you and I both know require immediate attention." The tension in Samuel's jaw returned. Evelina could feel the careful control in his grip on her arm, not restraining, but anchoring, as if he were holding on to something he didn't want to lose. "Excuse me," Evelina said quietly. "I should return to the castle." "You don't have to," Samuel began. "I do," she said, meeting his eyes. "It's quite all right." But it wasn't all right. Even as she walked back toward the castle, even as she heard Clara's bright laugh and Samuel's lower response behind her, Evelina felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd been foolish. Of course a man like the Duke of Blackthorn had a past. Of course there were beautiful women with claims on his attention, his time, his future. What had she been thinking? Walking in gardens and quoting poetry as if she were his equal, rather than a charity case he'd rescued on impulse. Behind her, Clara's voice drifted across the garden. "Now then, Samuel, about the promises you made." Evelina didn't look back. Chapter 7. The past arrives. Clara Ashford moved through Blackthorn Castle as if she'd never left. She knew which servants to address by name and which to ignore. She knew the morning room caught the best light and that the library had a draught near the east windows. She ordered tea without asking permission and rearranged flowers in the entrance hall with proprietary ease. Watching from the stairs, Evelina felt like the intruder she supposed she was. "She was engaged to His Grace, Mrs." Fletcher murmured, appearing at Evelina's elbow with the quiet sympathy of someone who'd witnessed too much and said too little. 2 years back. Lasted nearly 6 months before he ended it. Quite suddenly, if I recall. There was talk, but His Grace never explained, and Miss Ashford left for the continent shortly after. "I see," Evelina said, though she wasn't sure she did. "Thought you should know, miss." "Given Mrs." Fletcher gestured vaguely, encompassing everything. The rescue, the shattered glass, the poetry and gardens, the hope Evelina had been foolish enough to feel. Well, thought you should know. Over the next 3 days, Clara established herself at Blackthorn with the confidence of someone reclaiming lost territory. She presided over breakfast, organized evening entertainments, and attached herself to Samuel's side with the ease of long familiarity. And she was charming. That was perhaps the worst part. Evelina had expected obvious cruelty, the kind Lady Constance and Isabel wielded like blunt instruments. Instead, Clara deployed precision strikes disguised as kindness. "Miss Fairmont, what a lovely dress," she remarked on the second morning, her smile warm. Samuel always did have excellent taste. "He chose nearly my entire wardrobe when we were engaged, said he enjoyed imagining what would suit me." A delicate pause. "I'm sure he's equally thoughtful with all his charity cases." Or, at dinner, "Samuel, do you remember the Pemberton ball where you danced every dance with me? You said, what was it you said? That you'd never felt so understood by anyone." A light laugh. "How young we were. Though I suppose some connections transcend time, don't they?" Each comment was calculated to remind Evelina and Samuel of their shared history. Each smile carried the weight of intimacy Evelina could never match. Samuel, for his part, seemed increasingly tense. The ease Evelina had glimpsed in the garden was gone, replaced by the same careful control she'd seen at the ball. He was unfailingly polite to Clara, but distant. Still, he didn't ask her to leave. On the third afternoon, Evelina found herself alone in the morning room when Clara entered. "Ah, Miss Fairmont, I was hoping we might speak privately." Clara settled into a chair with practiced grace, arranging her skirts just so. "I feel we've gotten off on the wrong foot." "Have we?" Evelina kept her voice neutral. "I want you to understand I'm not the villain in this story." Clara's composure cracked slightly, revealing something raw beneath. "Do you know what happened when Samuel ended our engagement?" Evelina shook her head. "My family was ruined." The words came out flat, brutal in their simplicity. "Samuel's father had promised, swore to my father that the marriage would save us. We'd lost nearly everything in bad investments. You see, the Ashford name still carried weight, but we had no money, no prospects. The Duke promised that if I married Samuel, he'd clear our debts, restore our estate." Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "My father believed him. We all did. So when Samuel proposed, I accepted. I tried to love him truly. I did. I thought perhaps affection would grow. But 6 months into our engagement, Samuel ended it. Just ended it. Said he couldn't marry without love, as if love were something we could afford to wait for." "I'm sorry," Evelina said quietly, and meant it. "Are you?" Clara's eyes were hard. "My father lost our estate 3 months later. My sister had to marry Lord Hartwick, a man 30 years her senior, who treats her like property because it was that or destitution. My mother's health broke from the stress. She died last winter." The words hit like physical blows. Evelina had expected jealousy, possessiveness, romantic rivalry. Not this genuine tragedy. Consequences that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. "Miss Ashford, Clara, please. We're both victims of the same man's inability to honor his commitments." Clara leaned forward. "I'm not here because I love Samuel. I'm here because I'm desperate. My family is destroyed, Miss Fairmont. My sister writes me letters begging for help I cannot provide. And Samuel, who broke his promise, whose father's promise broke us, he lives here in comfort and luxury, while we suffer the consequences of his moral superiority." So you've come to what? Make him fulfill the engagement? I've come to make him take responsibility. Clara's voice hardened. He owes us. Not love, not affection, but obligation. His father made promises. His father's death doesn't erase those promises. After Clara left, Evelina sat in the morning room for a long time, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon light. She thought about duty and desire, about the weight of others' promises, about the way good people could cause harm simply by refusing to sacrifice themselves. She thought about her own father, who had married Lady Constance out of loneliness and inadvertently doomed his daughter to years of cruelty. She thought about Samuel's face when he'd said, "I couldn't marry her, not without love." Noble words, but at what cost to others? That evening, she saw them together. Evelina hadn't meant to intrude. She'd been in the library, losing herself in books as she'd always done when reality became too much to bear. But voices in the hallway drew her to the door, and through the crack, she saw them. Clara was crying genuine tears, not theatrical ones. Samuel's arms were around her, his hand stroking her hair with the ease of long familiarity. They stood in the hallway like that, and the intimacy of it, the obvious history, the shared grief was more painful than any of Clara's calculated comments. "I'm sorry," Samuel was saying. "I'm so sorry, Clara. If I'd known, if I'd understood the full extent." "But you did know," Clara said against his shoulder. "Your father told you. He told you what was at stake, and you chose your conscience over my family's survival." Evelina turned away before she could hear his response. She found him later that night in the drawing room, staring into the fire with the expression of a man fighting battles on multiple fronts. "I'm leaving," Evelina said without preamble. Samuel's head snapped up. "What?" "I'm going to find a position, as a governess perhaps, or a companion, something that will allow me to support myself." She kept her voice steady, matter of fact. "I'm grateful for your kindness these past days, but I cannot stay here. Because of Clara. It wasn't a question. Because I will not be the woman who waits while you resolve your past." Evelina met his eyes. "She's right, you know. You or your father made promises. People suffered when those promises were broken. That's not her fault. It's not yours either." "No. But I won't be caught between you and your guilt." She took a breath. "I won't compete with history, Samuel. I won't wait on the sidelines while you decide between duty and desire. I deserve more than that." Something flashed in his eyes, pride, perhaps, or pain. "You're right. You do deserve more." He stood, closing the distance between them. "Please don't go. Not yet. Give me time to—" "Time to what?" Evelina interrupted. "To resolve your engagement? To clear your father's debts? To figure out whether you're helping me because you want to or because you feel obligated? To figure out how to do right by everyone." The words burst from him with rare emotion. "Clara is right, my decision harmed her family. But I couldn't marry her, Evelina. I couldn't spend my life with someone I didn't love. Does that make me cruel? Selfish?" "It makes you human," Evelina said quietly. "But it doesn't change the fact that I won't wait while you decide what duty requires." They stood in silence, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Samuel spoke. "1 week." "What?" "Stay 1 week. Please," his voice gentled. "I know Mrs. Fletcher told me that next Thursday is the anniversary of your father's death. St. Michael's Church, where he's buried, is less than an hour's ride from here. Stay until then. Visit his grave. Give me 1 week to sort this." Evelina wanted to refuse, wanted to leave now, before hope could take deeper root. But the thought of visiting her father's grave, of not having to endure Lady Constance's cold presence on that day, weakened her resolve. 1 week, she agreed. "But Samuel, don't make promises to me that you can't keep. I've had enough of broken promises for one lifetime." That night, unable to sleep, Evelina wandered the castle's corridors. She'd meant to return to the Rose Room, but her feet carried her through unfamiliar hallways until she found herself outside a door she recognized as Samuel's study. The door was slightly ajar. Lamplight spilled through the crack. And voices. "You owe me this, Samuel." Clara's voice tight with emotion. "You owe my family. You know you do." "I know." Samuel sounded exhausted. "I've known since the day I ended our engagement. But Clara, but nothing. Your father promised mine that our families would be united. That promise cost my family everything when you broke it. The least, the absolute least you can do is honor it now. Even though we'd both be miserable, we'd be secure. Isn't that worth something?" A pause. "Or is your conscience more important than my sister's suffering? than the memory of what our families were. Evelina turned away, her heart hammering. She shouldn't have listened, shouldn't have heard, but now she couldn't unhear it. She fled back to the rose room, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she lay awake, watching moonlight track across the ceiling, and wondered how something that had felt so much like destiny 4 days ago could feel so much like mistake now. 1 week. She'd promised 1 week. After that, she would leave this place and its beautiful, guilt-ridden Duke and its desperate, tragic Clara. After that, she would find her own path, alone. Chapter 8. The Portrait and the Truth. Evelina could not bear another breakfast with Clara's pointed comments and Samuel's carefully neutral responses. She could not endure another day of watching them navigate shared history while she remained perpetually on the outside, an interloper in someone else's story. So she wandered. Blackthorn Castle was vast enough to lose oneself in, and Evelina had always been good at disappearing. She drifted through corridors she hadn't yet explored, past rooms whose purposes she could only guess, until she found herself in a long gallery lined with portraits. The faces that stared down at her were uniformly stern, generations of Armitages in various styles of dress, their expressions ranging from proud to imperious to vaguely disapproving. She walked slowly past them, studying features that occasionally echoed in Samuel's face: the strong jaw, the dark eyes, the bearing that came from generations of certainty about one's place in the world. Near the end of the gallery, she stopped. The portrait was smaller than the others, less prominently displayed. It showed a man in his 30s, handsome, with Samuel's eyes and a softer version of his features. Beside him stood a young woman, beautiful in the way morning frost is beautiful, perfect, cold, glittering. The woman was unmistakably Lady Constance, younger, unlined by bitterness, but undeniably her stepmother. The same sharp cheekbones, the same calculating eyes, the same smile that never quite reached its target. Evelina's hands trembled as she read the small brass plate affixed to the frame: Duke Richard Armitage and Lady Constance Ashworth, 1798. Ashworth, her stepmother's maiden name. Evelina's mind spun, trying to fit this piece into a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. Lady Constance and the late Duke. But that would mean shocked. Are you? Evelina spun to find an elderly woman in a housekeeper's black dress watching her from the doorway. Not Mrs. Fletcher, but someone older, ancient, really, with snow-white hair and eyes that held decades of witnessed secrets. Mrs. Dawson, the woman introduced herself. I've been housekeeper here since before the current Duke was born. I knew his father from boyhood. She moved closer, studying the portrait with an expression that might have been sadness. I knew her too, Lady Constance Ashworth, as she was then. They were. Evelina couldn't finish the sentence. Engaged, briefly. Mrs. Dawson's voice was matter-of-fact. 1798, just as the portrait says. Duke Richard was young, romantic, easily dazzled by a pretty face and clever conversation. She wanted the title, the wealth, the position. Seemed a fair enough exchange at the time. What happened? The late Duke met your father. Mrs. Dawson's expression softened. Thomas Fairmont. He came to visit on some business matter, I forget what now. But the Duke and your father took to each other immediately. True friendship, the kind that's rare between men of different stations. And your father, being an honest man, couldn't help but see what the Duke had been blind to. See what? Lady Constance's true nature. Mrs. Dawson's tone hardened. She was cruel to servants when she thought no one was watching, manipulative with those she deemed useful, social climbing to a degree that would have embarrassed the Duke once the first flush of infatuation wore off. Your father, being a friend, felt obligated to say something. Evelina felt cold spreading through her chest. The Duke ended the engagement. He did. And more than that, he helped your father court the woman who became your mother, Lady Margaret, the old vicar's daughter. Sweet girl, nothing like Lady Constance, true goodness in her. Mrs. Dawson shook her head. Lady Constance never forgave either man. She left for London in a fury, vowing they'd both regret humiliating her. And then, Evelina said slowly, pieces falling into place, my mother died. My father was alone with a young daughter, and Lady Constance saw her opportunity for revenge. Mrs. Dawson's voice was grim. She'd married once in London, a Mr. Ashworth, who left her with a daughter and not much else. But she kept her looks and her cunning. When she heard Thomas Fairmont was widowed and vulnerable, she came back. She was patient. I'll give her that. played the part of devoted companion perfectly until he married her. And then made my life a misery as payment for my father's honesty, Evelina finished. Though the late Duke never knew the full extent of it. He died before your father did, made Thomas promise to watch over his son if anything happened, and made Samuel promise the reverse. Mrs. Dawson's eyes were kind but pitying. The young Duke has been trying to honor that promise for 3 years, miss. He's been watching over you, in his way, just as his father asked. The words struck Evelina like physical blows. 3 years. Samuel had known about her for 3 years, known about the promise, about her stepmother's cruelty, about everything, and watched from a distance, fulfilling obligation. Thank you, Evelina managed, for telling me. She walked blindly from the gallery, her mind reeling. Everything made horrible sense now. Samuel's reaction when she'd told him her name, his fury at seeing her locked out, his insistence on protecting her, his careful questions about her father. Not attraction, not recognition of kindred spirits, obligation, guilt, a promise to a dead father. She found herself outside his study before she'd consciously decided to go there. The door was closed, but she knocked sharply, not caring about propriety or proper visiting hours. Enter. Samuel sat behind a massive desk covered in papers, looking tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. His expression shifted when he saw her surprise, then something that might have been relief. Evelina, I was hoping you knew. The words came out flat, accusatory. About my stepmother, about your father and hers, about the promise. Samuel went very still. Yes. For how long? Since my father died. He stood slowly, as if facing something inevitable. He told me on his deathbed, about the engagement, about why it ended, about Lady Constance's nature. He'd kept track of what happened to her over the years, knew she'd married your father, knew Thomas had died. He made me promise to watch over Thomas Fairmont's daughter, to ensure she was protected if Lady Constance's true nature emerged. So you've been watching me? Evelina felt something crack inside her chest. For 3 years, at balls, in village, everywhere, watching and doing nothing while she destroyed me piece by piece. I didn't know the full extent. You knew enough. Her voice rose despite her attempt at control. You saw me alone at every ball. You noticed, you said so yourself. But you did nothing because watching from a distance fulfilled the letter of your promise, if not the spirit. Samuel flinched as if she'd struck him. You're right. I failed that promise. I failed you. And the rescue, the kindness, the garden walk and poetry, and she couldn't continue. All of it was obligation, guilt, finally honoring a deathbed promise. It started as obligation. The words burst from him with raw frustration. Yes. Is that what you want to hear? My father made me promise to watch over you from a distance. I knew your stepmother's history. I saw you at balls and felt the weight of that unkept promise every time. But I didn't break that glass because of my father, Evelina. He moved around the desk toward her, his control finally shattering. I broke it because I couldn't bear seeing you trapped for one more second, because something in me broke when I saw you standing there with dignity intact, despite everything they'd done to you. Because for the first time in 2 years, I felt something other than hollow obligation. How can I believe that? Evelina's voice cracked. How can I trust that any of this is real when it's all built on a foundation of promises and guilt? How can I prove it's real when you've already decided it isn't? Samuel's voice matched hers in pain. What would you have me do? Evelina? Deny that I knew about the promise? Lie about why I first took notice of you? I won't do that. I won't build anything on lies. Then build nothing, Evelina said, tears finally spilling over. Because I can't. I won't be another obligation in your life, another duty to fulfill, another promise to keep. You're not, aren't I? She laughed bitterly. Your father promised to protect Thomas Fairmont's daughter. You're doing exactly that. How do you know? How do I know that anything you feel is real and not just the satisfaction of finally fulfilling your duty? Samuel stared at her, and for a moment she saw something like despair in his eyes. I don't know how to prove something you're determined not to believe. The words hung between them, insurmountable. Then perhaps, Evelina said quietly, we've reached an impasse. She turned toward the door, but Samuel's voice stopped her. Don't leave, please. Give me a chance to what? Convince me? Court me? Check me off your list of obligations? She looked back at him, this man who had saved her and complicated her and broken something open inside her, that she'd thought safely sealed. "I'm leaving in the morning, Samuel. I should have left days ago. After the anniversary," he said desperately. "You promised to stay through the anniversary of your father's death. 3 more days. Why? So you can fulfill your promise completely? Make sure Thomas Fairmont's daughter is properly settled before you move on to your next obligation." She shook her head. "No, I'm done being anyone's duty. Evelina." But she was already gone, fleeing down the corridor before he could see her crying. Before she could see whether he followed, he didn't. In the rose room, Evelina pulled out the small bag she'd arrived with. Everything she owned that mattered fit inside it easily. Her father's journal, the few items of clothing Samuel had purchased, nothing else. She'd come to Blackthorn Castle with nothing, and she would leave with scarcely more. Her hands shook as she packed. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't wipe them away. Tonight she would allow herself to grieve for what might have been, had circumstances been different. Had there been no promises, no obligations, no ghosts of the past shaping the present. Tomorrow she would leave. She would find a position somewhere, build a life on her own terms, stop waiting for someone else to decide her worth. But tonight she cried for the Duke who'd shattered glass for her but couldn't shatter the weight of his father's expectations. For herself, who'd been foolish enough to hope that being seen might be enough. For the space between them that seemed to grow wider with every honest word. Chapter 9. The Shattering. The morning of the 7th day dawned cold and clear. Evelina, dressed in the simple travelling clothes she'd arrived in, the ones Lady Constance had given her, now cleaned and pressed by sympathetic servants. Her bag sat packed by the door. After visiting her father's grave, she would leave Blackthorn Castle forever. The church of St. Michael stood at the edge of the village, its grey stone weathered by centuries. Evelina walked there alone, declining the carriage Samuel had offered through Mrs. Fletcher. The morning air was sharp with approaching winter, and the walk gave her time to prepare her heart for goodbye to her father, to the brief hope she'd allowed herself, to everything that might have been. She saw him before she reached the iron gates. Samuel stood beside her father's grave, his head bowed, his hands clasped behind his back. At his feet lay a wreath of white roses, winter roses, expensive and carefully chosen. Evelina almost turned back, but something, pride, perhaps, or the need for closure kept her moving forward. He looked up at her approach. For a moment, neither spoke. "I didn't mean to intrude," Samuel said finally. "I came at dawn. I thought you'd come later, in daylight, and I'd be gone by then." "Why did you come at all?" "To pay my respects to the man my father loved, the man who taught him what love should look like." Samuel's voice was quiet, stripped of the control she'd grown accustomed to. "My father told me once that your father showed him love wasn't possession or transaction, but genuine partnership. He regretted not learning that lesson in time to save his own marriage. He died wishing he'd been more like Thomas Fairmont." Evelina felt tears prick her eyes. She moved to stand beside the grave, reading the familiar inscription, "Thomas Fairmont. Beloved father, honest man." "He would have liked that," she said softly, "that he mattered to your father, that their friendship meant something." They stood in silence, two people mourning fathers who'd tried to shape a better future for their children and perhaps complicated it instead. "I loved him so much," Evelina whispered. "Sometimes I can barely remember his face clearly, but I remember how safe I felt when he was alive. Like nothing bad could truly touch me as long as he was there. My father used to say that's what good fathers do, they make the world feel conquerable." Samuel's voice was rough with emotion. "I miss him. Even though his promises have tangled everything, I miss him." It was the most honest thing he'd said to her. No careful control, no ducal propriety, just raw grief, matching hers. For a moment, standing in that churchyard with their shared losses laid bare between them, Evelina felt the anger that had sustained her through the night begin to crack. "I should go," she said, though she didn't move. "Back to the castle. Away from it. I've stayed longer than I intended." Samuel turned to face her fully. Evelina, whatever he'd been about to say, was interrupted by the sound of horses and carriage wheels. They both turned to see a commotion at the castle gates, visible from their vantage point on the hill. "What on earth?" Samuel murmured. They walked back together in tense silence. As they approached, the chaos became clearer. Several carriages crowded the drive, servants rushed about, and standing in the entrance hall, surrounded by what appeared to be half the county's gentry, was Clara Ashford. She'd staged this carefully. Evelina could see it in the theatrical arrangement of witnesses Lord and Lady Pemberton, The Ashfords, even, to Evelina's horror, Lady Constance and Isabel, looking vindicated and cruel in equal measure. Clara stood in the center of it all, a stack of papers in her hands, her face a mask of righteous desperation. "Ah, Samuel," she said as they entered. "How convenient. We were just discussing the matter of promises made by your father to mine." She held up the papers, letters, by the look of them, yellowed with age. "These documents detail the agreement between Duke Richard Armitage and my father, Baron Ashford, a marriage between myself and the future Duke of Blackthorn, in exchange for clearing our family's debts and restoring our position. Signed, witnessed, legally binding." "Clara," Samuel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 2 years ago, insisting on what's owed." Her eyes were bright with desperation. "You're so concerned with honoring your father's promises, Samuel. You watched over Miss Fairmont for 3 years because of one such promise. Surely you can honor the promise made to my family." Murmurs rippled through the assembled witnesses. Lady Constance's smile was sharp and satisfied. Isabel whispered to a nearby gentleman, her eyes on Evelina full of malicious triumph. Samuel moved forward, his hand extended. "May I see those letters?" Clara hesitated, then handed them over, with the confidence of someone holding an unbeatable hand. Evelina watched Samuel read, his expression unreadable, the silence stretched taut as wire. Then Samuel looked up, and something in his face made Clara's confidence flicker. "This letter," he said, holding up one of the pages, "is a forgery." The room erupted. Clara's face drained of color. "That's not, I would never. My father's handwriting is distinctive. I've read enough of his correspondence to know it by heart." Samuel's voice wasn't angry, it was sad. "This letter uses language he never would have used. Binding obligation. Irrevocable commitment. He believed in choice, Clara, always. The genuine letters discuss hopeful arrangements, not iron contracts. But this one," he held it up, "this one reads like a legal document designed to trap." Clara's composure shattered. "You owe me. Your family owes mine. My sister is trapped with a monster. My father died in disgrace. My mother," her voice broke. "I have nothing left, Samuel, nothing but this claim on you. And you would deny me even that?" "Clara," Samuel's voice was gentle now, "I am sorry for what my broken engagement cost your family. Truly. And I have already taken steps to address it. 6 months ago, through my solicitor, I cleared your father's remaining debts and established a trust for your sister. She can leave her husband if she chooses, with enough money to live independently." Clara stared at him. "You? What? I owed your family that much. I always knew it. But Clara," his voice firmed, "I do not owe you a marriage. No one owes anyone that. But she," Clara's finger stabbed toward Evelina, "you think you love her? She's as much an obligation as I am. Your father's deathbed promise. At least I was chosen once, for myself, even if only briefly. She's just duty wearing a pretty face." The words landed like stones in still water. Every eye turned to Evelina. Lady Constance's expression was triumphant. The assembled gentry leaned forward, hungry for scandal, but Samuel turned away from all of them. He crossed the space between himself and Evelina, and the rest of the room ceased to exist. "You're right," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "It started as duty. My father made me promise to watch over Thomas Fairmont's daughter, if anything happened to him. So I did, from a distance. I saw you at balls, alone and overlooked. I saw you in the village, being kind to people who didn't deserve it. I saw you endure humiliation with quiet dignity that put the rest of us to shame." He took a step closer, and somewhere in those 3 years of watching, duty became something else. I don't know exactly when. Maybe it was the first ball where I saw you standing alone but unbroken, refusing to let them make you small. Maybe it was the second, when you smiled at a child who'd stumbled into you, a genuine smile that transformed your whole face. Maybe it was the 10th, when I realized I looked for you in every crowd, that your presence had become the only thing that made those tedious events bearable. Another step. They were close enough now that Evelina could see the intensity in his dark eyes, the vulnerability he was choosing to show before all these witnesses. "But the night I broke that glass," his voice dropped, intimate despite the audience. "That wasn't duty, Evelina. That was need. Raw, selfish need. I couldn't bear seeing you trapped for one more second. Couldn't stand watching you stand there with dignity intact while they tried to break you. I shattered that glass because something in me broke when I saw you locked out in the cold." Then, shocking everyone, perhaps himself most of all, Samuel dropped to his knees before her. "I don't want you to marry me because it makes sense," he said, looking up at her. "I don't want you to stay because you have nowhere else to go. I want you to choose me freely or choose to walk away freely. Either way, you choose. Not duty, not obligation, not promises made by dead fathers. You." His voice roughened. "But know this. Obligation would never have driven me to shatter glass with my bare hands. Duty wouldn't have made me memorize the way you smile. A deathbed promise wouldn't have kept me awake these last nights, terrified you'd leave before I could find the words to make you understand. Stand up." Evelina's voice was barely a whisper. "Please." Chapter 10. The Rewriting of Fate. 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, the world could transform itself completely. Evelina had learned this truth slowly, day by precious day, as autumn deepened into winter at Blackthorn Castle. She'd stood up that day in the entrance hall, surrounded by witnesses and scandal, and told Samuel to rise. Then, before everyone assembled, she'd said simply, "I choose to stay. Not as your obligation, not as your betrothed, but as myself, to see if what we feel can survive without the weight of duty crushing it." The ton had been scandalized, of course. A young woman, unchaperoned, staying at a bachelor's estate. Unthinkable. But Samuel had invited his aunt, a formidable dowager Duchess, to take up residence as chaperone, and somehow the arrangement had become acceptable. Barely. The gossip had raged for weeks regardless. Evelina found she didn't care. The first week, Samuel's solicitor had arrived with documents that made Evelina's head spin. Her father's estate, modest but respectable, had been legally hers, upon reaching her majority at 21. Lady Constance had hidden this fact, controlling the funds through deliberate obscurity and Evelina's own ignorance of her rights. "It's not a fortune," the solicitor had explained, "but it's enough to provide independence. A house in the village, an income of £200 per annum. You need never be dependent on anyone again." The knowledge had settled into Evelina's chest like a key turning in a lock. Freedom, choice, the ability to walk away if she chose to, which made staying a true choice rather than necessity. Lady Constance, her cruelty finally exposed before witnesses who mattered, had retreated to a small property in the north. Without Evelina's inheritance to control, without social standing to maintain, she'd become irrelevant. The last Evelina had heard, her former stepmother lived in bitter isolation. Her machinations finally collapsed under their own weight. Isabel had surprised her. A letter had arrived in the 3rd week, not an apology, exactly, but an acknowledgement. Mother's bitterness poisoned everything she touched, including me. I'm going to live with our cousins in Scotland, away from her influence. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know. I'm trying to be better than what she made me." Even Clara had found her path forward. Samuel's financial support had given her family stability, and in a brief conversation before she'd left for the continent, she'd told Evelina with painful honesty, "I hated you for having what I couldn't, but he never looked at me the way he looks at you. I'm done fighting for scraps of affection. I deserve more than that. We both do." But the real transformation had been quieter, more intimate. It had happened in morning walks through frost-touched gardens, in evening hours spent in the library with books and conversation, in the slow, careful building of trust between two people who'd learned too young that the world could be cruel. Samuel had courted her properly, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with presence, with listening, with the kind of attention that said you matter more clearly than any declaration. They'd talked about everything. Their fears hers of being trapped again, his of becoming his father's mistakes. Their hopes hers for a life of purpose beyond survival, his for connection that went deeper than duty. Their wounds, the losses that had shaped them, the loneliness that had defined them, the walls they'd built to protect hearts that had been broken too often. And slowly, carefully, those walls had come down. Evelina had bloomed. She'd found her voice again, the one Lady Constance had tried to silence. She'd started expressing opinions, making decisions, taking up space without apology. The frightened girl who'd stood on a frozen balcony had become a woman who knew her own worth. Samuel had softened. The careful control had eased, replaced by genuine warmth. He'd learned to laugh again, to be vulnerable, to need someone without fearing that need made him weak. The isolated Duke had become a man capable of partnership. Now, standing in the empty ballroom on the evening of Samuel's winter ball, Evelina felt the weight of how far they'd traveled together. "The guests will arrive soon," Samuel said, standing beside her in evening dress that made him look both ducal and devastatingly handsome. "But I wanted a moment alone with you first." "Why?" Evelina asked, though her heart already knew. "Come, let me show you something." He led her across the gleaming floor to where the shattered glass doors had been replaced. The balcony doors stood open despite the cold symbolically, deliberately open, but it was the floor beneath their feet that made Evelina's breath catch. Where glass had fallen in glittering shards 6 weeks ago, artists had created an inlaid design in the marble. Silver tracery spread outward in a pattern of beautiful cracks, radiating from a central point like frozen lightning. The breaks were part of the design now, not hidden or erased, but transformed into something stunning. "Kintsugi," Evelina whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "The Japanese art of repairing broken things with gold. Silver, in this case," Samuel said. "But yes, you taught me that broken things can be made more beautiful for having been shattered, that the cracks are part of the story, not something to be ashamed of." Evelina knelt, tracing the silver lines with her fingers. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each crack preserved and honored, made precious rather than hidden. "We're like this," she said softly, "broken by what we've lost, but stronger for how we've healed." "We are." Samuel knelt beside her, "which brings me to why I wanted this moment alone." He took her hand, and Evelina felt her pulse quicken. "Evelina Fairmont," Samuel said, his voice steady but his eyes full of emotion that made her chest tight. "Will you marry me?" The question hung in the air between them, and Evelina found herself smiling even as tears spilled over. "You haven't finished," she said. "Haven't I?" "No. You have to tell me why. The right reasons." Understanding lit his face. He squeezed her hand gently. "Evelina Fairmont, will you marry me? Not because of our father's friendship, not because I rescued you, we both know you saved yourself as much as I did anything, not because it makes sense or satisfies obligation or completes some deathbed promise." His voice dropped, intimate and true. "Marry me because when I look at you, I see home. Marry me because you make me want to be the man who deserves you, the man who's brave enough to be vulnerable, who's strong enough to be gentle, who's wise enough to know that love is a choice we make every day. Marry me because I love you, freely chosen, freely given, with no ghosts between us." Evelina felt joy rising in her chest like spring after endless winter. "On one condition." "Anything. We are partners, equals. No locked doors, no obligations, no pedestals, just two people who choose each other, every day, who trust each other with their true selves, broken pieces and all." "Every day," Samuel agreed solemnly. "Starting now, starting always." "Then yes." Evelina laughed through her tears. "Yes, Samuel Armitage, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms there on the floor beside the silver-traced cracks and kissed her with the desperate relief of a man who'd finally found what he'd been searching for without knowing he was searching. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and grinning, the sound of arriving carriages drifted through the open doors. "Our guests," Samuel said. "Let them wait," Evelina replied, and kissed him again. An hour later, the ball was in full swing. The ton had turned out in force, curiosity, and scandal still drew crowds, even when the scandal had transformed into something resembling a love story. Samuel and Evelina opened the dancing as was traditional for the host, but this time, unlike the ball 6 weeks ago, Evelina wore a gown that fit her perfectly deep blue silk, that brought out the grey of her eyes, elegant and beautiful without being ostentatious. Her hair was arranged simply, and she wore no jewelry except a single strand of pearls that had been her mother's. She didn't need embellishment. She glowed from within. They danced, and the ballroom that had witnessed her humiliation now witnessed her triumph, not because she'd captured a duke, but because she'd captured herself, her confidence, her voice, her right to take up space in the world. "Did you see the way he looks at her?" Lady Pemberton whispered to her companion. "And she at him like equals," came the reply. "Not like a duke and his charity case, like partners." The whispers rippled through the ballroom, but for once they were admiring rather than cruel. The story of the shattered glass, the locked balcony, the duke who'd chosen love over obligation, it had caught the ton's imagination in a way that scandal alone never could. As the waltz carried them across the floor, Samuel and Evelina passed the open balcony doors. Evelina glanced at them and smiled a private smile, full of memory and meaning. Samuel followed her gaze and understood instantly. No more barriers, no more waiting, no more locked doors. He pulled her slightly closer, Propriety be damned, and she let him. They danced past the silver-traced cracks in the floor, past the watching crowds, past the ghosts of who they'd been before that November night when glass had shattered and everything had changed. The music swelled, and Evelina felt something settle in her chest, not just happiness, but peace. The bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly whom she was meant to be with, not because of fate or promises or obligation, but because they'd chosen it, chosen each other, every day. Starting now. I love you, Samuel murmured, quiet enough that only she could hear. I love you, Evelina replied. Freely chosen, freely given. Every day, he promised. Every day, she agreed, and they danced as if the music would never end. For them, it never would. And so, dear listeners, our tale of shattered glass and healing hearts comes to a close. Evelina and Samuel found what so many of us seek: not rescue, but partnership, not obligation, but choice, not perfection, but the courage to be beautifully, honestly broken together. If this story touched your heart, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a moment to leave a like. It helps other romance lovers discover these tales. And please, share your thoughts in the comments below. Did Samuel's transformation feel earned? What did you think of Clara's complexity? I read every comment, and your insights always add such richness to these stories. For those of you who've been following Evelina's journey, you know this is what Lyra's romance stories is all about. Tales where love isn't about being saved, but about choosing to be seen. Where happily ever after is earned through honesty, vulnerability, and the daily choice to show up for each other. If you're new here, welcome to our community of romance enthusiasts. Subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss a story. We have a library full of historical romances waiting for you, tales of second chances, forbidden love, and the kind of passion that changes everything. Until our next story, remember, like the silver-traced cracks in Blackthorn's ballroom floor, our broken places can become our most beautiful features, especially when someone loves us enough to see them as part of our story, not despite it. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sweet dreams, dear listeners, and may you find your own shattered glass moment, the one that changes everything. This is Lyra, signing off.